It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Friday, June 7th, 2024 in Los Angeles. He is Sam Park. In Los Angeles, I am John Ramey. We have an election in India, the world's largest democracy. We have an election in Mexico, and we have a ceasefire that is being talked about, not being outright rejected, not being outright accepted regarding the war in Gaza. Let us begin there, Sam Park. Last week, we talked about a plan that came from both Israeli senior officials and was endorsed by Joe Biden, a ceasefire plan. Hamas responded this week. The leader of Hamas said on Wednesday, this is reporting from Reuters, that Hamas would demand a permanent end to the war in Gaza and Israeli withdrawal as part of a ceasefire plan. Reuters characterized this as an apparent blow to the truce proposal from Joe Biden. But this plan kind of stays on the table, and there's kind of unattributed whisperings from both Hamas and Israeli officials that they're still kind of working on the one that's on the table. They haven't tossed it aside. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Both Hamas and Israel have voiced various objections to the plan, going, oh, I don't like this. And then the other side goes, oh, well, I don't like that. But none of them have rejected the plan outright. And it's, I think, worth mentioning that when we talked about this story last week, it had just broken about an hour or two before. And so it was pretty new then. I thought it was kind of odd, and I think other people did too, that Biden announced the plan, but he mentioned that it was an Israeli plan. So you might wonder, well, why didn't Israel announce it if it's their plan? What had not yet been reported, or at least I don't think had been at that moment, was that leaders of both houses of Congress had officially extended an invitation to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to address a joint session of Congress, which he's done several times already during his career as Israeli Prime Minister. And I actually think that Biden got wind of this and felt that he needed to get out ahead of it, because when Netanyahu makes such an address, he can sort of speak over Biden's head directly to the American people. And so Biden, I think, wanted to reciprocate, actually, and speak directly to the Israeli people, many of whom would like for Netanyahu to accept this proposal. Many of the families of the remaining hostages, for example. And of course, the hard right members of Netanyahu's coalition government, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, right, both said that they would leave Netanyahu's coalition government, causing the government to fall if he accepted the deal. And immediately thereafter, the opposition leader, Yair Lapid, the previous prime minister, who was defeated at the elections by Netanyahu's coalition government, said that he would support the government if Smotrich's party and Ben-Gvir's party left. But that hasn't been enough, apparently, to convince Netanyahu to accept this deal.
So Netanyahu, this is reporting from the New York Times now, Netanyahu has apparently said he's on board with this 6-week ceasefire behind closed doors, but publicly he's saying we will continue to fight until Hamas is eradicated. Now, obviously, Hamas is not going to sign a ceasefire or a truce or a peace plan that calls for their own eradication. So that's a sticking point, right?
Yeah.
So at some point, Hamas
one would think, yes.
Yeah, right. At some point, Hamas is going to say, we'll stop the war, but we get to still be in charge, at least in some capacity in Gaza. But it is interesting, the two sides that Netanyahu is having to deal with, right? Like the hard right wants him not only to not accept this peace plan, but to continue the war, even though it's, I'm guessing, increasingly unpopular in Israel to some degree.
I would imagine so, although that's not, that increase isn't very dramatic.
Sure.
I would say it's not,
but he's kind of in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation because of his splintering coalition.
Well, I would think so. And I would guess that he's more likely to side with the hard right folks than he is to want to bring Yair Lapid into his government, because along with Benny Gantz, who's in his war cabinet, Lapid and Gantz have had a government in Israel without Netanyahu,
Right.
whereas Smotrich and Ben-Gvir never have. Right. So, I mean, John, you're the sports guy. What would you do?
Right.
I mean,
I believe the technical term is dance with the one that brung you.
Yeah. Right. I mean, and so, but again, this deal is not dead. And so ongoing negotiations, I think, are always good.
Yeah, I would just say
they're not.
The fact that it hasn't been rejected out of hand and they're still kind of talking about this plan, I think is very encouraging. We haven't seen anything like this in the duration of the conflict, right?
That's right. I would agree with that, right? Except for the actual temporary ceasefire that helped release some of the hostages, right?
What was that, November, and that lasted about 5 minutes?
Well, it lasted long enough to release a few dozen hostages,
Sure.
and that's a good thing.
Right.
And by the way, I mean, a few dozen people were killed in central Gaza yesterday in supposedly a precision strike. There's some question as to how many of them were Hamas militants and how many of them were civilians, but there were definitely some of both. And this wasn't in Rafah, right, which was supposedly the last redoubt of Hamas. This was in the central part of Gaza, where apparently Hamas still has some operations, according to Israel, because otherwise, why bother to kill them? And so, Netanyahu's been saying for months that they're on the verge of total victory, which is obviously not true.
I mean, that is that's right out of the Vietnam playbook, right?
Absolutely, right? It's right there. So we'll have to see how this all plays out, which probably won't be very good, frankly, right? But at least there's a ceasefire proposal that's still on the table. And so we should be thankful for small favors, at least.
Mexico has elected their first woman president, Claudia Sheinbaum, who got her PhD in the early and middle 90s at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, the University of California. She's a climate scientist who has turned to politics, and now she is López Obrador, the incumbent's protege, and is essentially kind of taken the baton from him and has won the election. It's a bit Reagan to H.W. Bush-esque, right?
Sort of, yes. Again, she's not just the first female president, but also the first Jewish president of Mexico. And I'd like to point out that the United States has never done either of those things. But she is the protege of López Obrador. In Mexico, the presidents are limited to a single 6-year term. So, which I find a little odd, right? I think if someone does a good job as president, then you should be able to reelect them at once anyway.
Given Mexico's runaway history of kind of despotic leaders, I understand.
Yeah, exactly. I can give them a break on this. And since they've actually moved to a full two-party democracy, which is relatively recently, back in 2000, sometimes the incumbent party is able to get a second term with a new president, sometimes not. So, it often happens that the presidency switches parties every 6 years. And in fact, there was a spell there where there were 3 consecutive parties that took the presidency. And so there's not a long track record of this. It's difficult to make a lot of judgments about the general condition of Mexican democracy. But it was a resounding victory.
Yeah, she won by 30 points.
Something like that.
And also her rival was also a woman.
That's right.
Xochitl Galvez, who conceded.
That's right.
So let's put Mexico on the board as yet another democracy that has had a peaceful transition of power more recently than the United States.
Yes, that's correct. Although we should mention that in one of López Obrador's defeats, which was very narrow, by the way, I should mention that. He only lost by less than 1% in the popular vote. He mounted giant street protests, saying that it was rigged, even though he'd already held public office in elections that apparently were not rigged. Right. But it is not just a resounding victory for Sheinbaum, but a large endorsement of López Obrador, who is widely referred to as AMLO, right? His initials, Andrés Manuel López Obrador.
And he's wildly popular.
Yeah.
He's a populist.
Exactly. And finally, I mean, frankly, he's a little bit demagogic, I find him to
Oh,
be,
yeah,
and that is.
I would agree with that.
And very populist, as you say. And for example, I wonder if Mexicans will miss his week daily morning television program, in which he spends quite a great deal of time talking about the state of the nation.
Monday through Friday, he does a daily morning.
Yes, that's the Mañanera, it's called.
Wow.
And at 7 a.m., right? It's sort of like Good Morning Mexico, except it's
Yeah,
the
but it's
president.
the president. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a FDR quality to that.
Well, more recently, there's a Hugo Chavez quality to it, who I think his show was only weekly, if I'm not mistaken, on the weekend. But that show was called A lo Presidente. And
Clever
Chavez
title.
would go on for hours.
Yeah.
Right. And from what I get, I've never actually seen any of AMLO's TV programs, and I don't speak Spanish, so I couldn't actually understand what he was saying. But occasionally he seems to go on at quite some length himself. But it's unclear whether or not Claudia Sheinbaum will continue this, not quite tradition, because AMLO is the only Mexican president who's actually done this. But we'll have to see how she does. For example, as you say, she's a climate scientist, whereas AMLO has
been oilman.
Yeah, very friendly to the national oil company, Pemex. And he's also done other things, like he's heavily militarized Mexican society, not just law enforcement, but he's put them in charge of things like infrastructure projects and the like. And that gives me a great deal of pause. But we should say, though, that, again, he's very popular. This is the legitimately expressed will of the Mexican people. And if we say we believe in democracy, we have to not just accept that, but in fact, to some extent, embrace this result, even if I don't have any reason to be skeptical of Claudia Sheinbaum because she's not yet the president. In fact, won't be for several months.
No, not until October 1st.
Yes, there will still be dozens more episodes of the Mañanera that people can enjoy.
I would point out, just for if those of you not familiar with Mexican or Latin American politics generally, like Obrador and Chavez comparison kind of begins and ends at the television program. Like this is not.
I would say so.
This is not some aspiring communist totalitarian. Like Obrador is. Oh, what's the critique of him? He's probably not the biggest fan of judicial independence, I guess, maybe.
Certainly not, or media independence for that matter.
Right. So, I mean, he's not like a beacon of liberal democracy, but he has received the endorsement of the legitimate Mexican voting public, and now his protege
Absolutely.
has too.
And
yeah.
He didn't attempt to change the system in order to remain in power or anything like that. Now, some people suspect that he might try and wield power through his protege behind the scenes, right? That casting Claudia Sheinbaum as sort of his puppet, right? Now, that could happen, right?
Sure.
Again, two-party Mexican or multi-party Mexican democracy is a young institution.
Yeah, it's a 21st century phenomenon.
That's exactly right. So, it's difficult to say how this will work out. But it's also possible that Claudia Sheinbaum will say, guess what? I'm the president.
Yeah.
Right? And you know what? Sorry, AMLO. I mean, I'm the one in charge now. We'll have to see how this plays out. But obviously another huge issue in Mexico right now is criminal violence. And it's at a record high. And AMLO, and in fact, under AMLO's presidency, it's only gotten worse. And but the Mexican public doesn't seem to have blamed AMLO for that. And I would say they shouldn't, because it's not like AMLO invented criminal violence. It's,
or
that's
drug
been
cartels.
A huge problem. Yeah, it's been a huge problem in Mexico for many, many years. And yes, it certainly has gotten worse, and perhaps he hasn't handled it very well. But there's no reason that people should blame him for that. And I might add that even though economic growth in Mexico hasn't been especially strong, only on the order of 2 to 3% during the non-pandemic years, the benefits of economic growth have been very widely shared among Mexican society. Minimum wages increased dramatically. Poverty has fallen very dramatically. What do you know? It turns out people like that sort of thing.
Yeah, and investments in infrastructure, too.
That's true. Although, I mean, most of those investments have gone to well-established industrial conglomerates, which
Sure.
are, widely seen as, and I would say correctly seen as corrupt. But of course, corruption has also been an enormous problem in Mexico for a very long time. And unlike most of his predecessors, AMLO himself is not seen to be personally corrupt. And I think that redounds to his favor amongst the public as well.
Sheinbaum had been the mayor of Mexico City before winning the presidency, and I believe she had campaigned somewhat on her success dealing with violence as the mayor
Yes,
as
that's
part of her
correct.
campaign, which makes sense. I mean, I've been to Mexico
Exactly,
City.
especially if,
I don't recall when Sheinbaum's mayoral tenure began, but Mexico City is not like a place where you're terrified of violence all the time.
no, I think that's more an issue in some of the more
Yeah,
remote areas
yeah,
of Mexico.
yeah. And
But
I don't think that's
again,
because of her policy specifically, but like she can run on that somewhat credibly.
yeah, then in some ways, I think it is ascribed to her policy. She worked very closely with the police forces
Yeah.
to try and address. I mean, it's not like Mexico City's free of crime by any stretch of the
No, it's a big
imagination.
city. Yeah.
Yeah, and so she does have a very good track record on that. And to the extent that criminal violence is a major issue in Mexico, that probably was not the worst thing in the world for her to run on.
Just a couple other notes on Mexico. It's 130 million people. It's the 12th largest GDP, so the 12th largest economy in the world. So as we talk about Mexico and next we talk about India, just bear that in mind, right? These are big countries, big democracies, and it worked. Democracy worked. There was a
Yes, that's right.
concession. The president didn't try to extend his constitutionally mandated one-term limit, right? So, yay.
That's right.
Que
And so
bueno.
yeah, yeah, and in the end, I think we have to say that this is a good result.
India has concluded their election, which actually began back in April and finished up on the 1st of June. India is the world's most populous nation, 1.4 billion people, 447 native languages, fifth largest economy in the world, $3.9 trillion annually in GDP. And they are the world's largest democracy. It seems like an unbelievably complicated effort to get that many people to vote. 968 million people eligible to vote. 642 million voters participated in the election. 312 million of them were women. So you have nearly the population of the United States, but only women as a
That's right.
voting bloc within this Indian election. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi declared victory, although a much less impressive victory for his alliance, his National Democratic Alliance coalition, than was anticipated.
Yes, and this was a very surprising result, unlike the Mexican result. Claudia Sheinbaum was widely expected to win the Mexican presidency handily, which she did. And whereas people really thought that Modi and his BJP party was going to crush the opposition, and they still ended up the largest party in parliament, but they no longer have a majority by themselves. They will be able to put one together as a coalition. But Narendra Modi himself has never had to do that, either as prime minister or in his previous political job in running the state of Gujarat. And Modi is well known for having a rather autocratic style of governance inside of the very democratic system of government in India. And so he's not an especially young man, and it will be interesting to see how he gets used to the idea of having to govern in coalition with other people, which is just runs counter to his general personality and experience.
Well, in his victory speech, he claimed a mandate, which is an interesting way to describe winning more than 60 seats fewer for his BJP party than when they won in 2019. That BJP party, I guess that P is party, the
Yes.
Bharatiya Janta Party. That's the
Yeah,
Hindu Nationalist Party, right?
yeah. It's
That's
the
the party
that
that wants to claim the Taj Mahal is somehow not Islamic and other kind of semi crackpot erasure of the Islamic history of India type things, among
that's right.
their
I
other
mean,
priorities.
and Modi himself is, especially during the closing days of the campaign, became, in fact, more rabidly anti-Muslim than he was at the beginning of the campaign. But that's always been a very strong component of his politics. And as you say, the politics of his party, they feel as though ousting the British after World War II was just the first half of removing foreign influence from India.
So they
And
think partition is as consequential as removing the British.
yes, and they feel it's unfinished business, and the next thing they have to do is somehow expel the 200 million Muslims, or at least keep them down somehow. It's crazy. And if it weren't for the size of India's economy and their sort of geostrategic location and position, I think that people might not be so quick to cozy up to India, especially under Modi, as they have been. Well, he's been given warm welcomes and foreign capitals wherever he goes. And in a way, we can be thankful that the Indian voters seem to have rebuked him to some extent. For as you mentioned, voting took place in these elections over 7 weeks because it's a monumental undertaking. You have to sort of bring polling places to the people,
Right.
and so that they can show up to vote. And they've done these things, and people have voted. It's terrific. And so, but as time went on, it seemed like turnout for the BJP wasn't very strong. Like the exit polls seemed to indicate that. And Modi's response, as I said, seemed to be to just double down on the anti-Muslim rhetoric. And of course, in a country as large and diverse as India, it's very difficult, and I think ill-advised, to try to make sort of broad, sweeping analyses of how these things work out. So it's possible that this may have backfired on him, but there's probably other things going on. One thing I would say, though, that was consistent is that the opposition coalition, first of all, held together. It's composed of many parties.
That's the Opposition India Coalition that won a total of 232 seats.
Yes. It
Yeah.
stands for something like Indian National Development, something else, Alliance, right?
I appreciated the tidy acronym spelling India, the country.
Yeah,
in
but
question.
when the first word in your acronym is also India, it just seems so
Whatever.
kind of like a reach, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, but
They won
held together.
200. They won 232 seats, and it's 543 total seats in the lower house of parliament, which is what we're talking
Yeah, they
about. So that's a big chunk. Yeah,
they had dramatically increased their size of representation in parliament, and the leader of the Congress Party, which is the main party in the opposition coalition, is Rahul Gandhi. He's
I was going to say that's the Gandhi
scion
party.
of the the Nehru and Gandhi party, which was sort of the natural ruling party of India since independence, sort of like the institutional revolutionary party in Mexico, right? They ruled the country for decades. In this case, all under the auspices of the Nehru and Gandhi family, except for the previous Congress government led by Manmohan Singh. But he was also a sort of a crony of the Nehrus and Gandhis. But Rahul Gandhi had really iron message discipline. He campaigned relentlessly on the idea that if the BJP was able to get an even larger majority, which they seemed to think they were going to do, they would be able to amend the Indian constitution. In so doing, destroy the secular identity of the Indian Republic, which, considering the BJP's track record, seemed like a pretty good possibility. So this was the most consistent element in what is otherwise a very complex and variegated phenomenon of the Indian elections. That is, the most consistent element was the message discipline of the opposition coalition standing up for the Constitution and for secularism. So now, I'm not saying that that was the determinative factor. It's just the one that held steady all the way through the election process of 7 weeks.
Again, this is 640 some odd million people voting. So that's cool.
Yeah. And we'll have to see how this all plays out. India's an extraordinarily important country, right? They are a rapidly growing country, right? Their economic growth rates apparently are about 8%. But as we were just discussing, unlike in Mexico, where growth is not that high, but seems to be widely shared among the population, India is almost the exact opposite of that. They have high economic growth, but it's not filtering down. It seems to be going mainly to the very large industrial conglomerates that are, these days are very closely aligned with the BJP. And people don't feel that they're getting their fair share of this. So economic growth is very important, right? You need to have it. But by itself, it's not helping everybody.
Let's think about this. So first of all, I want to point out, both in Mexico and in India, these are free and fair elections. There's nobody crying foul, right? Nope. So that's great. We've talked about López Obrador, the outgoing Mexican president, whose protege just won there, and his populist tendencies, and maybe not super defensive or not embracing independent media or judiciary, right? He's a little antagonistic towards those values. You have Modi, who is a Hindu nationalist, who, as you described, campaigns on anti-Muslim rhetoric. And what are we doing, Zoom? That's weird. Who campaigns on anti-Muslim rhetoric and kind of demonizing 200 million of his citizens.
Yes. And I call them interlopers.
Right.
Interlopers.
Yeah, that's bad. I'm just trying to figure out on a spectrum of kind of autocrat within the dressings of democracy, right? Where do these leaders line up? Like, I think you would have somebody like Viktor Orban or Putin. Those are not free and fair elections, right? Right. And then these guys are kind of closer towards, I mean, even Trump would be closer towards the middle, right? Free and fair elections, more or less, but candidates who win who maybe don't have the utmost regard for democratic traditions and norms. Modi's got to be close. It's difficult. Modi's got to be closer to the autocratic side than outgoing Olmo, right, in Mexico?
I would think so, but that might only be because his system allows him to be, right? For instance, AMLO had to leave. Otherwise, right. Either that or he had to try and upend the entire system. He would have had to, make a very dramatic gesture of breaking with democracy entirely, right? Modi never had that problem.
I should point out, Modi is the prime minister. So he's just the leader of whoever's governing the lower house. They have a bicameral parliament in India. They also have a president who's like head of state and head of the military, but isn't the head of government.
That's right, but so does Germany, for that matter, right?
I was just as an aside, I was thinking about that. The head of state, but not head of government presidency gig sounds sweet.
Yeah, right.
Like, it's not a lot of heavy lifting.
No, I mean, you get a sash, and and you're the one who gets to greet everybody off the plane and stuff like that. It's pretty good.
It's not a bad gig. But anyway, sorry. But back to Modi. Yeah, he's the prime minister. There is no term limit, to the best of my knowledge, limiting a prime minister like you might have a president. And
however, during this campaign, he seemed to try, and many observers noted this, he seemed to try to turn it into a presidential style election, right? His face was everywhere and to an extent that was unusual in an Indian parliamentary election. And this is not just about the election. For example, many people in India depend on food aid, and all the bags of rice have Modi's picture on them.
That's
right?
like Trump's signature on the COVID checks.
Exactly like that, right? And he was the first prime minister, as far as I can tell, to do something like that. And so he seemed to be pushing against the boundaries of the parliamentary restrictions that are placed on him by the Indian governmental system. So, yeah, I would say that he was very much an aspiring autocrat to a greater extent than AMLO was. But again, AMLO faced certain constraints that would have been very difficult for him to overcome. And he might, in fact, be trying to govern through a puppet regime. I'm not saying he is. It's just possible.
No. I'll go back to my all-time favorite comparison about democratic norms versus political power. Ralphie, the bison that runs around Folsom Field before a Colorado football game, is political power. And the handlers holding on for dear life, guiding Ralphie around the stadium, are democratic norms.
Yes. I think, that's, I can't think of a better way to put that, John.
Yeah. Well, I had to sneak in sports. We have time for a kicker.
Well, before we get to that,
sorry. One thing
I would like to say, that something else that happened in India that very recently is that dozens of people died because of catastrophic heat. Temperatures in New Delhi this past week reached 122 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's like Death Valley in the summer.
This is a new record for Delhi. Similar temperatures have been recorded, I believe, yesterday in parts of Arizona and Nevada. Now, it's not as unusual there. It is unusual for those sorts of temperatures to be seen in those areas this early in the year.
Yeah, we're not to the solstice yet.
That's right. Something else that's happening in Mexico right now is that the water supply of Mexico City could run dry by the end of this month. And I could go on about people getting killed by catastrophic climate events in almost any part of the world. And I'd just like to say again, this is the global crisis that we should all be talking about all the time. But we can't, because somebody has to invade Ukraine and Hamas has to commit atrocities against Israel, and Israel has to launch a catastrophic and clumsy counterattack. And we have to talk about those things instead. And in fact, those two wars in Ukraine and Gaza don't really have much at all to do with climate change. But there are other wars happening right now that do. The 150 people were massacred in Sudan yesterday. That conflict does have something to do with climate change. And so do some of the other ones happening in Africa right now. And we do talk about them, maybe not as much as we might like to be able to. But the point I want to keep making is that climate change is the existential crisis of our age, and people don't seem to be able to get to that. And it's a shame.
On a lighter note, let's beat up on Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Reporting from NBC, already embattled and unpopular, Rishi Sunak cut short his time in Normandy for the 80th anniversary of D-Day to fly back to London for a TV interview that wasn't due to be broadcast until next week. Sunak has been criticized and has now apologized for what he said was, quote, a mistake. Not good to cut short your D-Day duties as the British Prime Minister to run back and record a TV program. I just thought that was, a mistake, as he said.
Sunak, I believe, is looking for the exits, right? I mean, he called the election sooner than people thought he was going to. I think he just figured, there's a lot of people already believed about him that Rishi Sunak only really cares about Rishi Sunak. And if that's not true, he's certainly acting like it is. He's like, you know what? There's nothing left for me here. I just want to get out, right? It's stupid, but
it's a rough look to blow off D-Day.
Yeah, it's terrible.
I just also, in the last seconds here, I just want to point out, as we celebrate the 80th anniversary of the D-Day invasion, hundreds of thousands of troops, manpower, equipment, all that. They coordinated all of that with wristwatches and rudimentary radio communication. From a logistical standpoint,
totally analog.
I continue to be blown away by that. Sorry, that's my.
It's very impressive.
It's unbelievable. Clipboard, stopwatches, and rudimentary radios. Okay, that'll do it for this week. What are we thinking about next week, Sam Park?
EU Parliament elections.
Ooh.
Electorama 2024 continues. Between India and the EU, these will be the biggest elections of the year, with the possible exception of our own here in the United States.
Right. He's Sam Park. I'm John Ramey. This has been Working for Crusoe. We will talk to you next Friday. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, folks.